Hello everyone, and welcome to Smart City Kids workshop on college admissions and standardized testing. My name is Erica Papier, and I am the Director of Business Development at Smart City Kids. I'm also the parent of a 5th grade boy and a 9th grade girl, my other hat. We are very appreciative that you took time out of your busy day to join us. I promise you will find the session to be tremendously informative. I want to briefly introduce Smart City Kids. We are a leading educational consulting company committed to helping students unlock their highest potential and reach their academic goals. For over 20 years, our consultants have guided families through the challenging admissions process and helped students gain admission to their top choice schools. We work with families applying to all levels, starting with nursery school, continuing all the way through college, including boarding school and special education. We take the stress out of the admissions process with concierge level support and personalized programs to fit each student's needs and goals. All of our consultants are former admissions officers at top schools across the country and know exactly what makes a successful application. And with our sister company, Smart City Tutors, we teach students the skills, the motivation, and the strategies they need to flourish in the classroom and beyond. In addition to academic support in all areas, we also provide our students with test preparation and executive function coaching. Everything we do is geared towards meeting each student's unique needs and academic goals. So I am honored to have the opportunity to introduce you to my two very impressive colleagues. First, Marielle Cassell. Marielle holds a BA from Smith College and an MA from Columbia University. She has worked in higher education for over 15 years. Marielle began her career at Columbia Business School, was Associate Dean for undergraduate admission at Princeton University, and oversaw MBA admissions at the University of Oxford's Business School. Marielle enjoys working with students to prepare for the exciting journey that is college admissions, helping them to find and amplify their unique voice. I am also excited to introduce you to another impressive team member, Andrew Gerleo. Andrew holds a BA from Brown University. After tutoring his classmates at Brown, he began his career at A-List Education, where he taught SAT prep courses, and continued at Fluent City, where he led Italian classes. Since 2021, he has been working with students at Smart City Tutors, where he specializes in test preparation for the SAT, ACT, ISEE, SSAT, and more. That's a little bit of alphabet soup, Andrew. Executive function coaching and academic support. With over 8 years of teaching experience, Andrew has worked with learners of all ages and believes that his role as an educator is to open doors for his students. So, before we get started, I just want to share that Smart City Tutors is pleased to offer a promotion to attendees of our session today. We will provide a complimentary tutoring session with a purchased package of 4 sessions. So you pay for 4 sessions and you get 5. So you can feel free to reach out to me for more information. Okay, introductions done. Let's get started. So Marielle, we will start with you. So can you talk about the changes in college admissions after the affirmative action case?
Thanks, Erica, and thank you for such kind introductions. So thanks everyone for attending. I think it's always important to start this particular webinar off with the fact that might be obvious from my introduction that I am not an attorney or lawyer, and I am only giving you sort of the perspective as a former associate dean of undergraduate admission at Princeton and having led several business school admission offices. So with that in mind, I'm not giving legal advice, nor obviously am I speaking on behalf of any of these universities. However, I have done an extensive literature review, and I think it's really important to sort of contextualize what this does for many of your students, for those of you here on this call, which is essentially not a whole lot. What changed with the Supreme Court decision is that schools are no longer allowed to take race into account. After that decision, the president's office issued a memo in which they asked that schools account for diversity in thinking about admissions decisions, wanting to get wanting to build classes that are robust in their profiles in terms of religious backgrounds, beliefs, cultural practices and attitudes, etc. Generally, sort of just the experience overall that students bring and come with. So you can say that they're not allowed to look at the box that students are actually still asked to check off on the Common Application, which is the application that that nearly every school accepts, with a few exceptions, because that data is actually still collected by the federal government for their own purposes, but the schools no longer see that race-based data. What schools have done instead is that they now ask very pointed essay questions so that students can talk about their rich experiences and backgrounds, and schools can then use those experiences to contextualize what students will bring to their campuses. So I would say that's probably the biggest change that students will see is in terms of the essay questions. Schools, universities have been anticipating this decision for many years, from my time at Princeton and beyond. So they've gotten pretty well practiced and well versed in the questions that they're asking, and they're generally based on community, how students give back to their community, how they're involved in their communities. They ask questions about how students deal with difficult conversations and topics. So they're really concerned with how students are going to participate in their universities. I think, as I'm sure Andrew would agree with me and Erica as well, as educators, we really believe in having robust and different students working together. It creates a really wonderful rapport and teaches people how to be kinder humans to one another. And I think it gives them a dialogue, and a way to have a dialogue at a really exciting point in their lives. So I think that it remains extremely important and relevant, and universities are very clear on that. In terms of what universities are doing outside of the essays, they're no longer, big changes are they're no longer allowed to run scholarship programs that are race-based. They're no longer allowed to run any sort of college prep programs that are race-based, but a big switch has been to looking for socioeconomic diversity, generally relying on the sad fact that a lot of people who are at lesser socioeconomic means generally are people from minority backgrounds. So using that to sort of raise all people up and using that as a factor, which is allowed. So that's quite interesting. Schools also still have to hold up different types of programs, such as Title IX. So there's a lot that goes on in the background, regardless of the fact that they're no longer allowed to take race into account. At the very highest level of elite education, that is probably less, that is where one would see the difference in terms of who is applying to those types of schools. But at a level of two-year institutions or much less competitive four-year institutions, there's not likely to be a huge change in the number and the types of people who are applying to those schools. But it is largely seen, and it hasn't been seen yet in the data because it's too early to say. Schools haven't confirmed their classes yet, and they generally don't publish data about their classes until late in the fall. However, what we'll likely see is a drop in the number of diverse applicants to the top schools because they'll see this as a barrier to them. I can tell you truly from my time in admissions, we made decisions based on the whole applicant. We looked for students who would be successful at Princeton, who would thrive there, who would be a good fit for both the university would be a good fit for them, and they would be a good fit for the university. Never, did decisions, and I think sometimes this is the imagination, right? The decisions come down to, well, we need X number of this type of person and X number of that type of person. We were sincerely searching for the best top students. As they were defined at that point in time. So I think all of that's really important to keep in mind. and I will stop talking. I could talk
Okay.
about this forever and let Erica go ahead and
Yeah.
ask the
Can
question.
you just clarify? There was a question, someone wanted to just understand what is Title IX that you just mentioned?
Oh, sure. Title IX is, as my layman's understanding of Title IX largely is about gender equality and the number of, generally how it plays out most evidently at universities are through sports teams. So you have to have an equal number of men's and women's sports teams. There's a lot more that goes on in Title IX, but that's generally the one that you would be the most visible.
Okay, thank you. I know each of these questions you could spend a lot of time on, so I appreciate the pause so that we will continue to move through the program. So just as a follow-up question, are there things that you think students can do to help position themselves well in the process? And I know that's a very loaded question and very different to each student, but can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that I actually get asked a lot. I think a lot of people think there is a magic bullet, and I certainly saw a lot of magic bullet type applications in my time. I think the most important thing for students to do, and it starts young, and this process, I'm always hesitant to say that someone is late to the process because there is so much anxiety and a lot of feelings caught up in this, and it's very emotional for everyone. So I wouldn't say that, but the earlier one can start the process just in terms of setting student expectations and having students think about what they really like to do, the better off a student is. So when if we start working with students who are quite young, that's generally what we spend a lot of time working with them on is, what do you like to do? And helping them think about and hone their interests and passions. Because when you're truly interested and passionate about something, when you're then asked to write about it in an application, that comes out on the page, and that, regardless of your writing ability, that is what captures the imagination of the person who is reading that. So my true best advice is there's not one magic way. There's not, I often get the question like, well, do you have to do it all? Do you have to do community service and a sport and a leadership position? And, the list goes on. And the answer is no, you don't. You have to really follow what it is that you're most interested in doing and using all of the opportunities you have available to you to expand upon that interest. Not everybody has the same opportunities available to them, and I think that's always really important to keep in mind. But if you have a lot of opportunities available to you, then we really encourage you to take advantage of those. There's nothing wrong with for instance, if your parents are, I don't know, if your parents are scientists and you also shockingly have an interest in science and you want to do a lab internship, there's nothing wrong with doing a lab internship with someone that they happen to know, right? That's just taking advantage of the opportunity that you have. So it's really important for students to think about, what is it I'm most interested in doing? I'll often get like, well, my parent says I should do X. And it's like, well, do you like X? And you're like, no. And it's like, well, then let's not do that because you're going to have to write about it. And if you don't like it, that really comes through. So I would say the best way to position yourself is to find a few things that you really like to do and put your whole heart in them, and the results will be good.
I think that's very actionable advice. I do. I think as a parent of a ninth grader, I'm now hearing you with slightly different ears than I used to. And I think that that's wonderful advice. And hopefully that's helpful to people. Okay, I don't want to go too much farther down that path. We have to stick to the topics at hand. We have a lot to cover. So this is a question to both of you, but Andrew, maybe we'll start with you. Do you think that the SAT, ACT is still relevant and impactful, even if some schools are still test optional, although I don't know how many schools are really going to be test optional for that much longer, but talk about your thoughts there. Andrew, maybe we can start with you.
For sure, yes. I mean, of course, the question is test optional for how long, but I think in terms of as it stands right now and as it has been for a long time, the SAT remains relevant for a couple of reasons. One of which is the fact that it qualifies you for certain merit scholarships. from colleges themselves and also from other organizations. You know, you often find that there is a period of time when your students are like, oh, let me see what scholarships I qualify for just based on my SAT score. And when I was working, when my organization was being contracted to public schools and nonprofits to teach SAT classes, I know that a lot of my students were in the room so that they could meet a baseline on their score, that they could qualify for merit scholarships that would give them access to college, essentially. Another thing that I think applies very broadly across the board is that people still use the SAT to set themselves, and the ACT as well, to add, to set themselves apart from other applicants. So, you know, when colleges are receiving so much information and so many different kinds of students are coming from so many different kinds of schools, if everyone's taking the SAT and the ACT, that is a kind of equalizing factor.
Yeah.
I would add from a university perspective, one of the best ways, and a lot of the schools who decided to reinstate the SAT, some of the early schools who decided to reinstate the SAT, and it should be said, schools like MIT and Georgetown, Georgia Tech, University of Georgia have actually reinstated the SAT a couple of years ago. So they've been requiring that. But it is the single greatest predictor of student success at that particular university, right? So they use that as a metric really to gauge, you know, if we're admitting this student, you know, are they likely to have a good 4 years here? And that's a really important metric, and that's one that they've all been leaning on. And I think that is the reason many schools will not be test optional after 2024, 2025. Silver lining, always good to have that. Many schools were test optional pre-pandemic, and those schools will remain test optional post this I don't know, evening out, smoothing out, whatever you want to call it. So there will still be schools out there that students don't need to send a test to. It's also important to note, because it is, you know, if it were its own country, what, like the fifth largest economy, the University of California is not allowed by law to take testing into account. So that is always one whole state I point to for students. And because the University of California schools are not allowed to take that into account, the schools that are within California generally don't require an SAT or ACT, because they know they're not going to get it from any California state resident. So
All very interesting information to have. Okay, so Andrew, can you help parents understand what is the difference? This is probably the question that you get asked multiple times a day. What is the difference between the SAT and the ACT? And how should students decide if they should take the SAT or the ACT?
Very good question. And yes, very relevant question to my every single day of work. I took both the SAT and the ACT before I even knew what either stood for. SAT stands for Scholastic Assessment Test. ACT stands for American College Testing. But when you boil it down, both of them are multiple choice tests that test reading, grammar, and math. And for the math part, you could use a calculator for both. Big differences between the two is that the ACT has a science section and an optional essay section. But it's important to note that the science section is not, you know, hard and fast science knowledge. It's basically an applied reading section. And it's just a reading section in disguise. So there are a couple graphs and a couple of basic science facts. But, you know, if you're a student who sees science and freaks out, that doesn't disqualify the ACT for you. Big difference since the SAT transition to digitally, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, is that on the ACT now, all questions count equally. That used to be how the SAT was as well. But due to their new shift to adaptive scoring that we'll talk about later, that is no longer the case. Also, the SAT is now completely digital. There is no paper option, while we still have that on the ACT. And the SAT is now a lot shorter than it used to be. And you have a little bit more time per question than you did on the SAT. So if I were a student now deciding whether I should take the SAT and the ACT, I would say, and I do say, that the best way is to try both and figure out which one works best for you and your brain as a learner. It's not the kind of thing where you have to sign up for the test to figure out which one works for you. There are a lot of digital resources, resources at school, and of course, test prep with a tutor or by yourself. And there is no hard and fast rule for which student would do better on which test, but a few things to consider in my head would be timing. Do you think you have the stamina to sit through a long test like the ACT? If you get accommodations, are you able to get your timing accommodations on either test? Are you really into reading? Because if reading is a priority for you, maybe ACT is the way to go. And also that consideration of digital versus analog. I have a student who, because of her disability, has a really hard time reading on screens. So that means she really wanted to take the ACT so she could look at paper. Oh, and the other big thing, which maybe Marielle can offer some more insight to from the college perspective, is this idea of super scoring.
Great way to tee up a question, Andrew. Thank you. Yes. So I actually think this is really important. So super score, a word that if you're not in college admissions, you have no idea what we're talking about. It's probably the hardest part about this job is remembering that not everybody knows what you know. So a super score is when you take the SAT is graded into two sections, math and verbal reasoning. If you, let's say you sit the test twice, and let's say the first time you get an 800 in math, hooray, and you get a 650 in verbal, and then the second time you sit, you get a 700 in math and you get a 720 in verbal. So they would take the 800 from the first sitting and the 720 in verbal, 800 in math from the first sitting and the 720 in verbal from the second sitting, and give you a combined score of 1520, which is obviously quite higher than either the combined scores that I just named. So that's a super score. Nearly every school will super score in SAT, the exception of Georgetown. Not some schools, but not all schools, and the list really varies, will do a composite super score of the ACT, because the ACT, as Andrew has just broken down, is in 4 sections, Andrew. And those 4 sections then make up a composite score out of 36. So some schools will just take your highest section and then reconfigure a composite score for you, but not all schools will do that. So I always counsel students to do their research in terms of who will take that composite score for the ACT, etc. I think that's really important just to keep in mind, because I know some students get very bent out of shape about this, understandably.
So Marielle, while we're on you, do you think schools have a preference between the two tests?
Great question. One I'm often asked. No, they simply do not care. They love it if you take a test. It helps them assess, again, whether or not you're a fit for that institution, but they simply do not care which one you take. And that is that.
Okay, that's easy. Okay, Andrew, back to you. So you mentioned the SAT being online. So can you speak a little bit about this change? Can students just sit at home and take the SAT, or how does it work? And is there any digital, plan for the same thing happening with the ACT? So just talk to us about all that.
For sure. I mean, first things first, big misconception. You cannot take the SAT at home. You still have to go to a testing center, but the test has transitioned to being fully digital as of this year. And it might seem like kind of an intimidating change, but at least the intention is quite positive, because first and foremost, the test is now significantly shorter. There used to be 4 sections. We had reading, writing and language, no calculator math, and calculator math. And now that is broken down to just 2 sections, and they're broken up, each of those sections, into 2 modules. So we have our reading and writing section, 2 modules in there, and then a math section, 2 modules in there, and calculator is allowed for the entire time for math. In fact, in the Blue Book testing app that you use for practice tests as well as the real test, there is a graphing calculator built into the platform that at least the initial students who have taken the first couple of digital SATs have said is a real game changer. We know also that content has changed a little bit as well. We are seeing more geometry and trigonometry in math. The reading passages have gotten a lot shorter, and there's more emphasis on vocabulary and structure transitions over grammar and idioms. Definitely trying to equalize it between ESL students and students who speak English as a native language. The other really big change that is the reason why the SAT is able to be shorter and try to do the same thing in a smaller amount of time is that they're implementing this thing called multi-stage adaptive design, which basically means that in the first module of both sections, there's an array of questions that have that vary in difficulty. And how you perform on the first module affects whether you get a sort of easier first module or a more difficult or second module, rather, more easier second module or a more difficult one. And the raw scores you get are scaled based on the difficulty of the questions that you answer. So that's what I meant before when I said that every question doesn't count equally anymore. On the ACT, I counsel my students, if a question is going to be a black hole question for you and you're going to sink 5 minutes into it, think about how you could answer 5 easy questions in that period. For the SAT, that kind of counseling doesn't really make sense anymore. And it might seem kind of freaky. It might seem like, oh, I'm doing well in the first module. Am I getting punished by getting harder questions? But the reality is when you get the more difficult second module, you need to get fewer questions correct to get a higher score. So they're giving you more of a challenge, they're rewarding you, and ideally that is going to work out for the better in the long run. We only have the results of a couple of digital SATs so far, and what we've seen from the March results is that students overall found the testing experience much more positive, much less tiring. But they did find the content a little bit more difficult around the board. And I think just like with any transition, there's going to be a period that's a bit rocky. But we are already seeing improvements from the March SAT to the May SAT, and hopefully that will just continue as well now that people are learning a little more about how to prepare for this kind of test.
Well, actually, Andrew, that leads so nicely into the next question. I was going to give Marielle one, but you just said that, so I think I'll stay with you. So how do you recommend that students prepare for this test?
That's a very good question.
You probably get a lot also. So help these parents.
Yes, for sure. I think first and foremost, some kind of prep is necessary because these tests are not just a measure of knowledge, but they are also a measure of preparation for a specific test format. And that goes for SAT and ACT. And I know it's in my interest to say, hey, you should come work with a tutor, but the reality is not everyone can and not everyone does, and that's okay. Because there are a lot of really great resources. College Board, which runs the SAT, and ACT. The College Board separately runs the SAT, and then ACT runs the ACT. They both offer digital resources. Something that's worth noting, though, is that March SAT students found that the Blue Book SAT practice tests that the College Board offers were a little easy compared to the actual test. So there are also a lot of really great outside resources to seek out. There are some books too. Another great way to practice for the SAT specifically will be taking the PSAT, which is a test that's offered in October of junior or sophomore year to students. And it's basically, training wheels for the SAT. It's in that adaptive format, like the new digital SAT. And it also helps students qualify for the National Merit Scholarship, which is another, great way to get your foot in the door for college. Other great opportunities would be taking a test prep class, some of which are offered in schools, or working with a tutor. And I can say from my experience being a tutor for more than 8 years, that working with a tutor is really great because it offers accountability. You get very personalized approach to your students' needs, as well as, strategies that are customized to each test. And, thinking about students, even the brightest students, they're still kids. So they often have, a hard time prioritizing what is the most important thing, what needs to be prioritized. And so I think that's when it's really useful to have an adult who's not their parent, who maybe they'll listen to a little more than a parent, to bounce off of in that way. And just as a little preview of the kind of work I do with my students as a tutor, something that I think very few people take advantage of without test prep is guessing. There is a multiple choice test for a reason. And they want to see how you can work backwards from those answer choices. So I know with my students, specifically with algebra, which accounts for now about a third of the math questions on the math section of the SAT, there are two kind of foolproof algebra techniques that you can use to answer at least half of them in under a minute.
Right. That's very helpful. You mean teenagers listen to other people than their parents? Really? That's a thing? Huh. Who knew? Ha ha. Okay, Marielle, another question for you. So let's talk about early decision. Tell us your thoughts about early decision. Do you recommend students pursue an early decision route, as that seems to be more and more prevalent? So help us understand that situation.
Yes. So, well, my thoughts are numerous on this, so I'll limit them. But early decision, just again, the nomenclature here. So early decision is the process by which you apply to a, it's very complicated. There's a lot that goes into this, but the process by which you apply to a university through what is called early decision. That means that you're sending your application generally in around the 1st of November, depending on the school, sometimes earlier. But you are signing an agreement saying that if you are accepted to that institution, you will be attending that institution. You will withdraw any application you have out at any other institution, and that's the school you will be going to. They will generally give you that decision sometime between I've never seen it earlier than this, but it happens. The 1st of December and too close for comfort, usually around the 22nd of December. So anywhere between that time period, they will issue their decision. Generally, you can only apply to one school early decision, but there are lots of little fine prints everywhere. You can always apply to a state institution at the same time you're applying to an early decision school. And then there are rules about which early decision school you're applying to, and are you then allowed to apply to other schools, what is called early action. Early action is non-binding, but it's the same process in which you'd get your application in early and then reviewed early. Why would you do any of this, you ask yourself? Most people don't have their acts together enough to send their applications in early. So you are in a much smaller pool of applicants as you're being reviewed. Schools are quite savvy, as I'm sure anybody who read that most recent New York Times op-ed piece, which was excellent, about admitting their classes in those early rounds. Some schools will admit up to 60% of their incoming class in an early round, generally early decision, not early action, which means that you are, let's just give an example, you're applying and 15,000 people apply in early decision and they're taking 60% of 15,000. Come regular decision, 40,000 people will apply, and now they're filling only 40% of the spots from a much higher number. Even if, like me, you cannot do any math, you know that the odds are not in your favor for regular decision at that point. So I generally do recommend, if a student has a school that they like and they do offer early decision, that a student seriously consider that as an option for them. Not all early decision schools take that huge number of students. Cornell last year very publicly said that they were no longer going to take such a large percentage of their class in early. They still take anywhere between, don't quote me on Cornell, but the Ivies in general take anywhere from about 14 to 18% of their class. The early decision Ivies take anywhere between 14 and 18% of their class in early decision, which again is still a huge number and it's still a much smaller pool of applicants. So if a student likes an early decision school, I generally say, I would strongly encourage you to do that. You have a much higher chance, particularly if there's something in the application that is less shiny or desirable. That being said, I think there are lots of reasons not to do early decision. You're not sure, you don't really know. Financial aid will be a big factor in all of this. You need to actually see what those financial aids awards look like. If that is the case, I tell students, please do not apply early decision. That is not the place for you. students do all land somewhere. You know, we were talking about this at the beginning of before the webinar started, talking about, you know, just how does anybody get in anywhere anymore? They do. You do apply to a lot more schools, and the results are that you don't apply to 15 schools and get 15 yeses. You might apply to 15 schools and get 4 yeses. You might apply to 15 schools and get 3 yeses. As I tell all the students I work with, you can only go to one place. There's only one school you can go to. So, and you know, when they do have their, even if they have, let's say they have 3 options, it's very hard for them to choose between those 3. So, and then there's a whole other thing that goes along there, right? So I think this process does work out in the end. I think lists, you know, we talk a lot about the list. I think lists need to be very consciously devised. I think they have to have a range of schools on them. I think that when I say a school, I say this all the time. I should just be paid every time I say this. I'd be very rich. Just because I say a school is one that you are likely to admitted to does not mean it is a bad school. It just means that they happen to have a whole lot more spaces than a school that has very few spaces. It does not mean you will get a bad education. It does not mean that you will be ignored. It does not mean that you will have friends. It does not mean that you will be a failure in life. It does not mean that you will never get a job. It just means that it is probable, due to the number of students they accept, that you will get in. So I think it's really important to, when we use that kind of, I always say, I use this kind of language because I don't really know how else to help you understand when somewhere is very hard to get into and when somewhere is less difficult to get into. But that there shouldn't be a value judgment on that. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And you know, it's something that I really try and belabor. I do belabor. So as I am doing now, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. I have one follow-up question with something you just said, and then questions have started to come into the Q&A, so I'll throw those out there to you. I don't want people to get married to any particular numbers. I know that you are throwing out numbers as examples. You happen to mention, if you apply to 15 schools, I could just see parents listening today wondering, did she mean that that's how many schools we should apply to? So were you just using that number as an example, or were you saying that that's a rough number you recommend? I know it depends on the student, but can you just speak to that a little bit? I don't want anyone to really get married to numbers.
No one should get married to numbers. I just use it as examples. It depends on the student. I mean, it really depends on the student. I'll just leave it at that. It depends on the student. I would say some students I work with, we apply to 4 schools. I have some students I work with, we apply to 8 schools. I have some students I work with, I don't recommend ever applying more than 15 schools. You're actually limited on the common application to 20 schools. That's too many schools. Do not do that to yourself. I think 12 is always a good number if we're aiming at things. That gives you, I think of them in 3 categories, 4 categories. So that gives you 3 for each, right? If you needed an unlikely reach, a target, and a likely, right? And then you have a nice balanced list with 12. That's what I'll say.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm done with my questions. So for the parents who are listening, thank you for already getting going with adding questions. So please feel free to put questions in the chat. Okay, so I have I'm sorry, in the Q&A. So first question, Andrew, is there any strategy to prepare for the vocabulary part of testing?
For sure. I mean, I think a big part of the vocabulary part of testing is taking practice tests, because a lot of those words, they come back over and over. And if you're a student who loves reading, you will see those words just out in the world. If you're not, it's not the end of the world. And I think one of the great parts of working with a tutor is that we know all of the vocabulary words that have been on the SAT since the 1990s. We have a flashcard deck that has all of those in there. And I think something else that I do with my students that really helps, even with those really random vocabulary words that come up once every 10 years, is that I work with Latin and Greek roots to make sure that if you run into an unfamiliar vocabulary word, you can maybe try to break it down for parts and see what direction it's kind of leaning to.
Thank you. Okay, Marielle, this one is for you, and it's a very specific question. You might not have a very specific answer, but I'll pose it anyway. What percentage of early decision applicants are athletic and special interest recruits?
Great question. Generally all, not all, most of the most athletic recruitment happens in the early round. So that's just a general thing. It's not all of them. It depends on the school, as usually is the actual answer, but it would be most of them. So just depending on how many they're allowed by the NCAA, who oversees and regulates all of this, as well as their own athletic leagues, who regulates all of this, as well as their president and trustees, who also regulate all of that. Then that's the whatever number of recruited athletes. Generally happens in the early round, so that does take some of that up. And then the special interest cases generally also apply in the early rounds. I sense the savviness behind this question. So what I will say, and what I say to my own students, is that schools that practice what is called restrictive single choice early action, schools such as Princeton, Harvard, and Yale, where you're only allowed to apply to one of those schools early, those spots are generally all spoken for. Okay, so I always tell this to students. I say, let's not burn that early application there, because I can tell you generally, unless you are one of those people, what's going to happen to it. Those places are generally all spoken for. So they do special interest socioeconomic programs, student applicants that they get in that early round. They do almost all of their athletic recruitment in that round, most of the special interest cases in that round, though not all of them, but a fair number. So generally all those spots are spoken for. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind. I would say at schools that have much larger student populations, it's different. They have more spots. At a school that only admits, I'll just speak from my Princeton background because although those numbers have I think now changed anyway, but when I was there, we admitted about 1,900 students for about 1,200 spots. That's it. That's all we had. I now think they have about 1,600 spots. So they're probably admitting about 2,200 students. But that's out of about 45,000 applications.
And special interest means what? Someone has to follow up.
Oh, special interest means things like usually donors, big donors.
Okay.
Special ties to the university. Things like that.
Okay, Andrew, how many times can a student take the SAT and/or the ACT?
I'm sure Marielle will have something to say about this too. But on paper, you can take it as many times as you want, but as a tutor, please don't take it a huge amount of times. The way that I like to talk about it with my students is that standardized prepping is kind of like running a marathon, where your body is not meant to run a marathon every day. And it's not meant to run a marathon every month. I'm a long distance runner, and you know how it feels the day after you run a big race. It's like you wake up and everything is creaking. And it takes away energy from extracurriculars, it takes away energy from academics, and it also just puts a big stress on the student. But that being said, I would go for quality over quantity in terms of testing. I would want to test 1 to 3 times very well, then 7 times poorly. So that means planning around sports seasons, planning around big extracurricular events, theater shows, regents, other kinds of tests. So I would say that is individual to every student, depends on different circumstances too. But I would say go for quality over quantity there.
Marielle, you have anything to add?
No, I don't. I say the same thing. I'll tell students, you get students who get, and Andrew knows, they're like, you just need to do it one more time. And I'm like, listen, I'm not going to be the person who stands in your way, and you're going to be like, I didn't get into X because if I only had taken it once more, and then I would have done well, right? But I do put my foot down eventually. I really think 3 is a fine number. And then I want a good argument for the 4th. That's how I feel.
Okay. You drive a hard bargain. Okay, Marielle, can you talk to us about the application essays and their impact on college admissions?
Sure. I had a really good colleague at Vanderbilt who I used to travel with who would say, a great college essay does not outweigh bad grades and test scores. That was
Fair
her
enough.
opening line. And I really appreciated that. It is true. But a good college essay is valuable, and does help contextualize an applicant and what they care about. It's their one shot in the process to really give their voice to the whole moment, right? It's everything else is either metrics or letters of recommendation. So it's a nice opportunity for a student to say, this is who I am and what I believe in and what I'm about and what I care about. And this is why I care about those things. So they are very important. And I always encourage to spend a lot of time on that, to think about those. I remind them that this isn't like an academic piece of writing they've done for school, that it's not just one draft and you're finished. It's not just 2 revisions and you're done. It's many, many revisions. It's a lot of trial and error. The other thing I remind them is that you can have too many opinions. And that I frankly don't care what your friends think about this essay. Or sometimes even your parents. Apologies, parents, but it's I think, and I do think that there can be too many hands on an essay. But a good essay, a very good essay, along with other good things, I think does raise the boat for some students and allows them to shine much more brightly. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So I would say both the essay has the ability to really make an application shine and stand out, but it does not have the ability to erase all very big blemishes.
Marielle, can you tell when a parent has had too much of a hand in a student's essay?
Well, yes, because they generally don't write the entire application, and you will see huge changes in the styles of writing on an application. Oftentimes they'll just use words or phrasing that like a kid wouldn't use, or sometimes things are just too well argued. Which can always be quite funny. But yeah, but you can't always tell. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm sure the wool's been pulled over my eyes many times, but generally, yeah, you can tell.
Okay, last question. I think someone said that their child is taking the SAT for the first time this week, and the student is a junior. If she doesn't like her first score, when would you recommend she take her second, maybe third test?
For sure. I think this goes back to that other comment I made about the marathon. I would take into account what her summer looks like, if she's planning to go to summer camp, what, her priorities will be during the summer. I know when I was that age, I wanted to get it done before the school year started, but maybe that student doesn't feel the same way. So I would make sure that she had a conversation with her parents, her tutor, and maybe her college counselor as well, to make a plan to say, this is when I will have the time to dedicate several weeks to test prep so that I can get this done. And if that doesn't work out, here is my next time. But if she's going to be a junior, then she still has a little bit amount of time, so I wouldn't put too much of a rush on it.
Okay, great. Okay, any other questions? I think we're all set. So I want to thank the parents. Oh, is this webinar, someone just asked, is this webinar recording available? Yes, the webinar recording is available. I will be sending it out at some point this week. You will get a copy of the presentation. So Andrew and Marielle, thank you so much for your tremendously helpful guidance. For those parents who missed my introduction, I just want to say again that Smart City Tutors is offering a promotion for the parents who attend. You will receive a complimentary tutoring session with a purchased package of 4 sessions. So if you pay for 4, you will get 5. So you can reach out to me for further information. And we are here. We are here to support you in your college admissions journey, in your test preparation journey. So please don't hesitate to reach out if we can support you and your student in any way. And thank you so very much for joining us. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.